It's tough to foreshadow something in a way that doesn't give the game away, but is also recognizable by general audience. But with some help from the fine folks at Our Movie Details, it's time to shine a light on these all-time feats of cinematic foreshadowing, each leaving a ludicrously sly hint of coming events hidden in plain sight, in movies with ridiculously subtle foreshadowing that nobody noticed.
Caesar handing a knife to Will's dad, Rise of the Planet of the Apes. With Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes set several hundred years after the death of Caesar in War of the Planet of the Apes, the true vision of the franchise has now been realized. Everyone knew the context of the previous films, and it was no secret that this was the direction things were going. But that didn't stop some subtle foreshadowing right at the very start of the trilogy, as something of a mirror image to Caesar's early journey, learning new things and developing his brain. Will's father, Charles, who was essentially Caesar's grandfather, was struggling with dementia, and his condition was declining. At one point he forgot that he didn't drive, and at another he held his knife the wrong way around. When Caesar turned it around for him and passed it back, this wasn't just a small moment of the ape helping his family member, it was a precursor to the shift in power that was about to come. Nick Fury's Earthline hints at the Skrull within Spider-Man Far From Home. It was eventually revealed in the end credits scene that followed J. Jonah Jameson's Peter Parker mic drop that the Nick Fury fans had been watching throughout Spider-Man Far From Home was actually the Skrull Talos all along, with Fury being off-world. However, there was a rather brilliant clue that hinted at this not being the real Fury on screen during the events of the second solo Spidey MCU outing. Back when Parker meets Quentin Beck for the first time in Venice inside a secret base, the young Avenger is informed by Fury that Mysterio apparently isn't actually from his world. But it's the way the eye-patched icon delivers that revelation that acts as a subtle piece of foreshadowing. His line of "Mr. Beck is from Earth, just not yours" may not have felt that weird during a first watch. However, the fact Fury didn't opt for the word ours when talking about this spinning ball of chaos suggested pretty early on that this wasn't actually the bloke who brought the Avengers together at all. But I've got a quick question for you. What's your favourite MCU end credit scene? Was it the Nick Fury Skrull reveal or something else? Let me know in the comments section right down below this video.
Amy's pen collection reveals her true nature, Gone Girl. David Fincher's Gone Girl is a masterfully wrought mystery thriller about the disappearance of Amy Dunn and the intense suspicions surrounding her shady husband Nick. But the movie's big twist is that Amy is actually alive and well, having faked her own kidnapping in order to frame Nick after he had an affair with a student. Yet attentive viewers can catch a frankly brilliant sliver of foreshadowing in one of the movie's opening scenes, where we briefly observe Amy writing in her diary, a diary which is later entered as evidence to suggest that Nick was an abusive husband. Ultimately, it turns out that Amy fabricated the diary to further heighten suspicion around Nick, and literally 3 minutes into the movie, we can see a number of different coloured pens with their lids off on the table next to the diary. While audiences won't think any of this on a first viewing, it is of course a blatant clue that Amy is cooking up the diary entries, using different pens to make it seem as though they were written at different times. That's David Fincher's commitment to detail for you.
As harmless as a stuffed bird, Psycho. There is no denying that Alfred Hitchcock was a master of suspense, and there can be few greater examples of such talent as 1960's Psycho. The film, based around psychotic killer Norman Bates, is one of the most influential in the history of the horror genre, and is nothing short of iconic. As the narrative follows the search for the missing Marion Crane, the victim of the infamous shower stabbing scene, it's revealed that Norman killed his mother and kept her mummified and essentially taxidermied, often actually taking on her personality himself as some form of a coping mechanism. Right then, during Norman's conversation with Marion toward the beginning of the film, he of course never lets on the true fate of his mother. As far as his guest is concerned, she is alive and well. However, when she suggests to Norman that his mother should be institutionalized after seemingly overhearing an argument between them, the son takes great offense. When he asks why she would say such a thing, he says that his mother is as harmless as one of his taxidermied birds. Only after seeing the body reveal does it make sense just how similar to those birds she actually was. Spooky stuff. This isn't even the only foreshadowing revolving around Norman's stuffed animals, in that a strong parallel is established between the killer and his owl, both being nocturnal predators. Linking his mother to his hobby, however, is done with just the slightest bit more subtlety. The clothes the 4 visitors wear foreshadow their part in the apocalypse. Knock at the cabin. Rudely interrupting Eric, Andrew, and Wen's family vacation in the woods, 4 mysterious figures break into a cabin and tie up 2 fathers in the early stages of M. Night Shyamalan's Knock at the Cabin. By the time Leonard, Sabrina, Adrian, and Redmond had all been killed by one another each time the family refused to sacrifice one of their own to save the world, each death releasing a plague on the earth, Eric had finally come to the realization that this peculiar bunch actually represented the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the Book of Revelations. This was secretly evident from the moment the strangers entered the holiday home, however. The colours each of the figures attempting to keep the world from ending were wearing matched up with the 4 different riders mentioned in the Bible. The White Rider for Leonard, Red Rider for Redmond, Black Rider for Adrian, and Pale Rider for Sabrina.
Bob has a portrait of a deer above his head because he's going to die, the killing of a sacred deer. Yorgos Lanthimos' deeply discomforting psychological thriller, The Killing of a Sacred Deer, definitely isn't for everyone. Revolving around a cardiac surgeon Stephen who was cursed by a teenage boy and given a choice. Either kill one member of his family, or watch them all die. At the end of the film, Stephen finally decides to kill a member of his family by tying them all up and randomly firing a rifle at one of them while he's blindfolded. This causes the horrifying death of his young son, Bob, in turn breaking the curse. However, Bob's sacrificial death is basically signposted earlier in the movie, when after Bob wakes up and can't feel his legs, the first step of the 3-part curse, we see the painting of a deer hanging above his bed. Given that Bob is ultimately the sacred deer who dies in the film's climax, it's pretty clear in its implications, though the painting is also faint enough to be easily missed in the otherwise unremarkable shot.
Blue Skies on Mars, Total Recall. Looking for a movie where you can't say for certain whether the whole thing was a dream or not by the time the credits roll? Forget Inception and look no further than Total Recall, baby. The fate of Arnold Schwarzenegger's Douglas Quaid played with the minds of audiences long before Leonardo DiCaprio did. The events of Total Recall revolve around Quaid becoming something of an action hero, though it is presented in a way that never confirms whether this was truly what happened, or if it was just the result of the manufactured memories he wanted implanted in his mind. While the film very much leaves this question open to interpretation, there's a clever bit of foreshadowing that may lend more weight to the "it was all a dream" line of thinking. It all comes back to the blue skies on Mars. As part of Quaid's implanted memories, one of the technicians remarks that Blue Sky on Mars was a new one, meaning this was the first time he had manufactured such a detail before. While there is a perfectly valid in-universe explanation for the sky on Mars changing from red to blue, there is no reason to think this wasn't also a part of the manufactured dream. The movie is undoubtedly open-ended, but it's difficult to ignore the evidence that points to it all happening inside of Quaid's mind. Is this your favourite Arnie movie of all time? Well, if it's not, you let me know what is in the comment section down below. The song playing when Dr. Grant meets the Kirbys subtly hints at their lies. Jurassic Park III. It's eventually revealed that the real reason the seemingly rich Kirbys wanted Dr. Alan Grant to accompany them on their trip to Isla Sorna in Jurassic Park III actually had nothing to do with their wedding. They just wanted to go and find their son. If you listen closely during the scene where the deceptive Kirby twosome trick Grant into guiding them on their upcoming tour of the island by promising to fund his research though, a sign that these two parents were full of crap could be heard on the jukebox. As the not all that wealthy Paul and Amanda talk about how much it would mean to them for the Jurassic Park survivor to join the pair on this journey, Randy Newman's Big Hat No Cattle tune is accompanying the lie over dinner. The lyrics in the song focus on lying and pretending to be something you're not, which is exactly what these two dishonest and desperate parents were doing for much of the Jurassic threequel.
Frank's wife is reading a book about getting pregnant because he's infertile, The Departed. Martin Scorsese's Oscar-winning mob classic The Departed is wholly concerned with perceived masculine potency. Much of the film is centered around sexual impotence and fertility, what with the clear implication that Colin Sullivan is impotent and his girlfriend Madeline was actually impregnated by her secret lover Billy. A climactic confrontation between Sullivan and mob boss Frank Costello also seems to confirm that Costello was infertile as well, as Sullivan mockingly says to him, "All that murdering and fucking and no sons." The shooting script even includes an additional line which was cut from the final film where Sullivan adds, "What are you, shooting blanks?" before shooting Costello dead. Costello's infertility is basically confirmed if you pay close attention to a scene earlier in the film though, where his much younger wife Gwen can be seen reading a book called Getting Pregnant. Whether self-motivated or encouraged to research her own fertility by an anxious Frank, it's clear that the pair have struggled to conceive a baby, as is backed up by Sullivan's taunting comment moments before he kills Frank.
Hartley admitted he was the bad guy, Red Notice. There is no shortage of movies that feature a twist towards the end that one of the good guys was really a bad guy all along. It's something that can be incredibly effective when done right, but due to it being such an overused trope, it can be hard to pull off in a satisfying manner. However, not all of them outright give the game away at the very beginning. This is the route Red Notice chose, and it works surprisingly well. Yep, I'm as surprised as you are. The film has a relatively by-the-numbers story about the unlikely duo of Ryan Reynolds' master thief Nolan Booth and Dwayne Johnson's FBI agent John Hartley coming together to stop Gal Gadot's villain, the Bishop. The chemistry between Reynolds and The Rock carried much of the weight, but the reveal at the end that Hartley and the Bishop were partners all along was a good one, really. What made it even better was that during Booth and Hartley's first interaction, the latter admitted he was the bad guy, but no one noticed as he appeared to be speaking in the context of Booth's perspective. There were certain other moments that pointed to Hartley's true nature, but none quite like this. Peacemaker's image shows you his fate before it was confirmed later on, the Suicide Squad. Fresh off of murdering Rick Flag, Peacemaker looks to kill his second all-important hard drive-holding Suicide Squad member, because he's thorough. Before he can pull the trigger on Ratcatcher 2 though, Bloodsport drops in on the moment, and the two sharpshooters proceed to fire a bullet at the other. Peacemaker is then shot through his own bullet, as you do, and then crushed by the crumbling Jotunheim reactor. The broy Captain America would ultimately be seen surprisingly recovering in a hospital bed, of course, with director James Gunn later noting how the end credits scene revealing he hadn't actually died was only added after he agreed to create the anti-hero spin-off TV show. And what a show it was. However, keep an eye on the moment Waller threatens to kill the remaining Task Force X crew not too long after Peacemaker's apparent death, and you'll spot a little bit of surprise survival foreshadowing Gunn seemingly decided to add to the flick too. Within the kill box that contains the pictures of the various Suicide Squad members, Peacemaker's image can still be seen. Every other member who had been killed up to this point had been blanked out in the box, but the silver-headed a-hole's picture is still there, hinting that he was still amongst the living before that eventual post-credit stinger.
A musical choice spells out the big twist, Hot Fuzz. Edgar Wright is one of cinema's all-time great masters of foreshadowing, and his comedy classic Hot Fuzz includes many visual and spoken nods to the movie's balmy array of twists and turns. It is eventually revealed that the serial killer slaughtering their way through the sleepy village of Sanford is actually various members of the Neighborhood Watch Alliance, who collude to kill anyone they suspect might ruin Sanford's chances of winning Village of the Year. There are numerous hints to this hidden in plain sight earlier in the film, not least that when hotshot cop Nicholas Angel is running through Sanford shortly after moving there, the Kinks' classic tune Village Green Preservation Society is playing over the top. Beyond the title, the song's lyrics are very much indicative of the movie's big reveal, reading, quote, "preserving the old ways from being abused, protecting the new ways for me and for you." Cheekily, however, Wright fades the music out just as the song reaches this part, though if you're a fan of the Kinks, you'll doubtless have them committed to memory regardless.
John Kramer's blueprint, Saw. Though fans of the franchise have come to expect shocks and twists aplenty, the very first Saw film was something of an unknown quantity when it released in 2004. From the initial realization of the situation Adam and Dr. Lawrence Gordon were in, to the horrific reverse bear trap Amanda managed to narrowly escape, and Gordon cutting his own foot off with a hacksaw. There were some truly gruesome scenes in there. However, arguably the biggest shock was when the previously thought to be corpse got up and revealed himself to be Tobin Bell's John Kramer, the patient that Dr. Gordon had been speaking about much earlier in the film. It was a huge reveal that Kramer was in fact Jigsaw. However, this was foreshadowed perfectly before the movie was even 20 minutes into its runtime. For just a split second while Lawrence is addressing his colleagues around John's bed, the killer appears on screen, and though he is fast asleep, this shot tells audiences everything they need to know about him. On the table in front of him is a sketch of the reverse bear trap that would be used so many times throughout the franchise. This teased that he was the killer all along, but no one would have ever noticed it until at least a second or third viewing. Well played, folks. Cheers for checking out this video today, my friends. Now hit that subscribe button down below for more of this Whatculture stuff in your day. Miranda Tate warned Daggett that money wouldn't buy him power over Bane. The Dark Knight Rises. After giving the towering force of nature an earful, and claiming that he was in charge of the situation during The Dark Knight Rises, Bane calmly places his hand on the petrified businessman and asks John Daggett if that's how he really felt. In other words, does he feel in charge? It didn't matter that Daggett had paid the Titan a small fortune. Bane soon showed him that this certainly didn't give him power over the necessary evil by swiftly ending the arrogant soul's life. Bane wasn't the first person Daggett encountered who didn't share his opinion of money equaling power though. While wandering around Wayne Manor during a charity event earlier on in the picture, Miranda Tate let him know that she didn't want to waste her time chatting to a bloke who only understood money and the power he thought it bought. Hey, that rhymes. Right there and then, the woman who would ultimately be revealed as the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, and the child saved by Bane all those years ago, subtly foreshadowed how Daggett's belief in money giving him full control would likely be his downfall.
Linda's rage issues are literally spelled out: the Mitchells versus the Machines. The Mitchells versus the Machines features a scene where the malevolent virtual assistant Pal scans the Mitchells for perceived character flaws. The screen then fills up with a laundry list of hilarious flaws, most of which pass by too quickly for anyone to take them in without pausing the movie. Though we don't know it at the time, this scene is also basically revealing how the Mitchells will be saved at the end, by listing the flaw secret rage issues in the bottom left corner of the screen. This turns out to belong to the otherwise buttoned-down Mother Linda, who reveals her inner rage monster during the film's climax, basically going full Mama Bear to save her family from the Machines.
Chuck can't handle his gun, Shutter Island. Shutter Island is completely and utterly mind-boggling in the very best possible way. It's one thing to have an unreliable narrator, but to have a narrator who doesn't know himself that he's unreliable? This played a huge part in the truly shocking reveal at the end of the film. Though Leonardo DiCaprio's Teddy Daniels arrived on Ashcliffe as a US Marshal, looking into the mystery of a missing patient with his partner Chuck at his side, it was revealed at the end that very little of what the audience had seen was actually real. Daniels was actually Andrew Ladis, a patient of the mental institution, and was being put through a drastic experiment to try and make a breakthrough in his treatments. Part of the facade was that one of the doctors on the island, Dr. Sheehan, played the part of Chuck, Daniels' partner, and when he entered the room at the end to be introduced as the absent Dr. Sheehan, it was a hell of a bombshell. Minds were blown. However, it was alluded to at the very beginning of the film. When Daniels and Chuck were asked to hand over their firearms upon entering the hospital, the latter struggled to get his out of the holster. Of course, this was because he was not a US Marshal and had little to no experience handling a gun. It's a huge red flag looking back once you know the truth, but at the time, nothing at all was thought about it. Despite what Indiana Jones says, sometimes X does mark the spot, the Last Crusade. It's safe to say Indiana Jones knows a thing or two about archaeology. Well, it is his job. So why wouldn't his students believe their professor towards the beginning of The Last Crusade, when he explained to them in a lecture that 70% of all archaeology was done in a library, they don't follow maps to treasure, and X never ever marks the spot? Hilariously though, as Jones' quest to find the Holy Grail eventually takes him to a library of all places later in the flick, you'll never guess which Roman numeral marks the entrance to the tomb they're looking for. And on top of X unquestionably marking the spot during their adventure, Indy, his father, and the Nazis all use a map in order to find where the legendary Grail is. Once again contradicting the professor's earlier foreshadowing stuff statement to his class.
Dex's laboratory spoils the ending, Signs. M. Night Shyamalan loves to toy with audiences and includes sneaky narrative hints in his films wherever possible, though perhaps his more subtle feat of foreshadowing occurs just 15 minutes into his sci-fi smash hit Signs. At this point, Shyamalan focuses on Graham Hess's young daughter Bo while she's watching the cartoon Dex's Laboratory, the episode Don't Be a Hero to be precise. In the scene, a Martian gets hit with a rolled up newspaper before Dexter is dunked headfirst into a fishbowl. And lo and behold, how do the Hesses defeat the aliens in the movie's climax? Well, Graham's brother Merrill beats up the alien with a baseball bat and then spills water on it. This foreshadowing was only recently unearthed by a keen-eyed Redditor, confirming that Shyamalan's good movies just keep on giving even 2 decades later.
Orange means death, The Godfather. Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather is widely regarded as a masterpiece of epic proportions. It should come as no surprise then that a movie held in such high regard can boast such exemplary instances of filmmaking genius. One such example is the use of oranges. Reportedly, the fruits were initially added into certain sets for little more reason than a splash of colour against a largely dreary backdrop. However, ultimately they grew to be something far more important and meaningful. When you watch The Godfather, anytime you see an orange, you know something bad is about to happen. When Don Vito Corleone gets shot, he is at a fruit stall, and when he falls to the floor, the oranges scatter all across the road. There are oranges on the dinner table where Jack Waltz is sharing a meal with Tom Hagen, before an innocent horse is relieved of its head in order to make a point. Even when Don Vito dies of a heart attack, just moments before, he is using an orange rind to make faces at his grandson. And once you know to look for it, you can never watch The Godfather in the same way again.
A broken Thor mural is cracked across the right eye, which he loses. Thor Ragnarok. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is absolutely jam-packed with foreshadowing across its 24 releases to date, and one of the most slyly clever ones comes late in Thor Ragnarok. Moments before Thor battles his half-sister Hela at the end of the movie, he finds a damaged Asgardian mural of himself with a large distinctive crack running across his right eye. At first glance, this seems like nothing irregular, until Thor ends up losing his right eye a few minutes later while fighting Hela. Obviously, nobody had any clue what was being teed up on a first viewing, but on repeat sits, it's clear as day that director Taika Waititi was having some fun foreshadowing the grisly event about to take place.
Alan Grant's belt buckle, Jurassic Park. There can be no denying that Jurassic Park is an important staple of the cinematic industry. The movie released over 30 years ago. Its visuals still hold up to this day. The franchise is still relevant to this day, albeit never since reaching the lofty heights of 1993, and it produced more than a few iconic moments. One of the most memorable and quotable is Jeff Goldblum's Ian Malcolm telling John Hammond that life, finds a way, of course. This was his explanation as to why he had concerns about an island of all-female dinosaurs eventually breeding. Concerns that were vindicated during their stay on Isla Nublar, since some of the animals had their dino DNA patched up with that of frogs, some of which had been known to change sex in a single-gender environment. A number of the dinosaurs followed suit. Life found a way, as did Alan Grant's seatbelt on the helicopter ride to the park. It sounds strange that those two things could be connected, but exactly the same thing happened. When beginning their descent, Grant found that he had two female parts to a belt buckle, and so couldn't connect them. Instead, he simply tied them in a knot around his waist. He found a way to work around the situation, just as life did with all female dinosaurs. The King and Queen's first date hints at the former's true form, Shrek 2. As King Harold and Queen Lillian argue over the fact their daughter ended up with a big green ogre instead of Prince Charming early on in Shrek 2, the latter reminds her man that love isn't exactly predictable, and it's here when Harold recalls the pair's first kiss, one that went down as the two were enjoying a lovely walk by the lily pond. Also, when examining the pair's bedroom, there's actually a tapestry on the wall boasting a number of lily pads on a pond too. All of this secretly foreshadowed the eventual jaw-dropping reveal of Harold's true form being that of a frog, with the king being turned into a human by the fairy godmother. And if that wasn't enough of a hint at the warty soul that was always hiding within the king, Harold was also recognised by a female frog in a bar later on in the flick, suggesting that she possibly remembered him from his amphibian days.
Somerset turns to Mills when discussing Envy 7. Now this one's really subtle, so much so that only the most truly attentive of viewers have a hope in hell of noticing it. Roughly 25 minutes into David Fincher's masterful thriller 7, Detective Somerset begins reeling off the 7 deadly sins, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, pride, and lust. But when he gets to the 7th and final one, Envy, he suddenly turns to his partner, Detective Mills. Now this might seem irrelevant at an untrained glance, but considering that John Doe's envy-based kill sees him murdering Mills's own wife Tracy, it feels like a far more loaded, pointed movement on both Fincher and actor Morgan Freeman's parts. Some have even suggested that Mills's face is covered up by Somerset's photographs to symbolize the film's infamous head-in-a-box ending, though that's probably maybe one reach too far.
Twin Birds, The Prestige. One of Christopher Nolan's more underrated works is The Prestige, a sublime tale that pitted two rival magicians against each other in Hugh Jackman's Robert Angier and Christian Bale's Alfred Borden. One of the best and most ingenious aspects was the foreshadowing of Borden's story. The reality behind Borden's teleportation act was that he had a twin brother, with whom he shared his identity and who allowed him to perform seemingly impossible feats of wonder. However, things took a much darker turn when his brother took the fall for him when he was sentenced to death. That's some serious brotherly love. This was cleverly foreshadowed much earlier in the film though, when Borden performed a trick with a bird in front of a child. Though the bird was seemingly crushed, the magic was that it was actually perfectly fine. This was in truth a completely different bird switched in for the one that had been legitimately killed, eerily similar to how Borden was unscathed as his twin died. The lads certainly painted the town red, the world's end. When the crew take a moment to admire Newton Haven within the first 20 minutes of The World's End, Gary King tells his pals to take a moment to look upon it in its original colours, boys, because tonight we paint it red. And while they would ultimately end up painting it somewhat blue in the various pubs they'd visit, as soon as they found themselves in the middle of an alien invasion, King was actually frighteningly accurate in the end, in the wake of the network eventually deciding to do one after a frustrating conversation with King and his pals. The small town is completely destroyed. What's left of Newton Haven is bathed in red light, as Gary and those who survive this life-changing night on the town take in the fiery destruction left behind. Loves his foreshadowing, Mr. Right, doesn't he?
The diner scene sets up the criminal's fates, Reservoir Dogs. Quentin Tarantino's debut, Reservoir Dogs, opens with some absolutely legendary foreshadowing. Its unforgettable diner sequence as the 8 focal criminals sit down to eat breakfast ahead of their heist nods towards major events involving the 4 major characters. For starters, Steve Buscemi's Mr. Pink goes off about his refusal to tip waitresses, underlying his selfishness as is reflected by him attempting to flee with the diamonds at the very end. Harvey Keitel's Mr. White memorably dresses Mr. Pink down for refusing to tip, noting that it helps single mothers make ends meet, demonstrating his compassionate attitude, which ultimately gets him killed when he defends Mr. Orange. Of course, Tim Roth's Mr. Orange is an undercover cop, and when gang leader Joe asks who didn't tip at the diner, Orange quickly informs on Mr. Pink, reflecting his status as a rat. Then there's Michael Madsen's Mr. Blonde, who at the diner makes several references to shooting people, indicating his generally psychopathic, bloodthirsty nature when dealing with the kidnapped cop Marvin. So, everything you need to know about what's lying in store for the focal characters is right there during this brilliantly crafted introductory scene.
5 Musketeers, The World's End. Throughout Edgar Wright's The World's End, Simon Pegg's Gary King talked a lot of nonsense, as you'd expect from someone who never quite grew up. Being a grown-up sucks anyway. However, one bit of supposed nonsense was secretly a simply astonishing piece of foreshadowing. When Gary finally got together with his old school friends Oliver, Peter, Stephen and Andy, he called them the 5 Musketeers. To the conversation that there were only actually 3 or 4 if you count D'Artagnan, to which Gary responded that 5 would have been way better. That way 2 of them could die and you'd still be left with 3 Musketeers. Guess what happened to the group of 5? Oliver and Peter were both killed by the androids that had secretly taken over Newton Haven, leaving the 3 Musketeers of Gary, Andy and Stephen to face them alone. Truly outstanding stuff, eh? The amount of times Anthony McCoy's name is spoken foreshadows his fate, Candyman. Becoming obsessed with the urban legend of the Candyman throughout the 2021 sequel to the 1992 supernatural horror classic, artist Anthony McCoy eventually turns into the latest version of the titular spirit. If you were listening carefully during Nia DaCosta's creepy sequel though, you may have spotted a brilliant piece of foreshadowing that pointed to McCoy's eventual hook-handed fate. The protagonist's full name is said a grand total of precisely 5 times in the film's runtime. And how many times must a person say the Candyman's name in a mirror before he shows up and murders the fool who decided to test this particular urban legend? You guessed it, 5. It's an ace detail hidden in plain sight that sneakily links Anthony to the supernatural force he is destined to become, with McCoy finally transforming into the newest member of the Hive as the flick reached its end.